And by the way, that means even if it's with the person you marry. I'm not just saying if you have sex and then you marry that same person, it's all good. No, you know what? Oddly, maybe to you, it has implications. It affects issues of trust. It affects issues of security. It affects issues, all the things we talked about already, it affects. All right? Singles, it makes a difference what you do now. It does make a difference. Couples, it can be healed. Whatever baggage you have as a couple, whether you got it before you were married or after you were married, if you destroyed the intimacy with infidelity or pornography, if you weren't faithful to your spouse before you got married, those things can be healed. God does heal those things, and He will heal those things. Is it a little extra effort? Is it a little extra baggage? Do you have to relearn the ideal of sex? Yes. But what I want to say to both singles and couples about this is that it is worth it to make the effort for the future. It is worth it to make the effort for the future. I promised my wife I wouldn't embarrass her. I'm trying to do my best this morning. But let me just say this. My wife and I have been married about 20 years. And it is so much better today than it was when we got married. There's a process. There's a progress. There's stages to this. Think long term. It's worth the effort. It's worth the effort. In the short term, there may seem to be gains to simply forego sex if you're a couple, or simply have sex if you're a single. But it's worth it to make the effort for the future. It will be that much better. All right? Had to be said. All failed marriages fail for the same reason. You like that? It's that simple. It comes down to this. Are you ready? All failed marriages fail for the same reason. I could say they give up. That would have been true too, but that's not what I'm going to say. All failed marriages fail for the same reason. It's as simple as lack of communication. At some point, they stop talking about something. And when you stop talking about something, intimacy becomes impossible. And when intimacy becomes impossible, then you begin to think goofy things about each other, and then who knows where you go from there. There's a verse from James about the importance of your speech. We're going to skip it for now. I want you to think about this. You know, when you ask people why their marriages failed, they never say communication. Almost never. They actually list 4 other things. These are the 4 big things. But when you really ask them about these, what turns out is that these are the things they couldn't talk about in their marriage. They could never communicate about these things. What you want to guess? What do you think the 4 big issues people don't talk about in their marriage? Any guesses? Money? What else? What? Sex? What else? What? Kids. Good. You guys are great. You got 3 of the 4 right there. Okay. Sex. You don't talk about sex. Kids. You don't talk about the kids. Can you imagine? Doesn't that sound weird? Would you just look at it from objectively? How can you not talk about the kids? In-laws. It's the one you left out. And money. Money is listed as the number 1 cause. Sex is the number 2. But in both cases, it's very clear the real issue is communication. It's tense, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. The one area in my marriage, and I mean it, the one area in my marriage where tension is almost unavoidable is money. It is so much easier not to talk about it. And you know what I've discovered after 20 years? That's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. Not talking about it, just thinking, whatever, I'll deal with it, I'll fix it, we don't need to talk about it because it just makes her stressed, I'm just going to protect her. See, I can even make it sound spiritual. I'm going to protect her. I just said protect her. I'm going to protect her, but not talking about it. That's a terrible idea. It increases the tension tenfold. And then she feels unprotected because she feels like she doesn't know what's going on. Communication. Communication. If you can learn to communicate, you got to learn to communicate. If you don't know how to communicate well, you've got to learn it, because ultimately it's the biggest problem in every marriage. And all successful marriages share one thing: a clean slate. You know what happens in every marriage? Conflict. Every marriage. You know what happens in conflict in every marriage? Somebody gets hurt. Always. There's not a marriage alive where there isn't somebody hurt somebody else at some point along the process of the marriage. Happens in every marriage. If it doesn't happen in the marriage, it's only because you're not communicating, and then you just don't know how much you've hurt each other. That's all. It happens. You hurt each other. The marriages that succeed are not the marriages that have the least amount of conflict. The marriages that succeed are not the ones that have the least amount of tension. The marriages that succeed are not the ones where nobody ever hurts anybody, because those don't exist. The marriages that succeed are those that know how to make a clean slate after the injury has occurred. 2 things about this. One is learn to apologize. My goodness, learn to apologize. Have you ever listened to yourself apologize sometimes? Some of you guys, it's terrible. Okay, here it is. Here's what I do with my kids, all right? We make our kids do this. Lauren will testify, sometimes they get really irked at us that we make them still do it. But this is what we tell them to do. I won't make her, but she could stand up and tell you today what it is that we have them do. It's a formula. We do it the same way every time, because if you don't, you just haven't learned to apologize. Okay? You say this. You say, I'm sorry. It's a good start. I hate those Maxwell House commercials that they used to have where this husband and wife wake up and they're all angry with each other. You can tell they had a fight the night before, and they get up and the husband goes downstairs and he makes coffee, and she wakes up and she smells the coffee and she comes downstairs and everybody's happy. And you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking, just stretch that commercial out another 10 minutes. Because in the next 10 minutes, he's going to do something and she's going to get really mad at him because they never resolved what happened last night. They just had coffee. Love never means having to say you're sorry is baloney. You say, I'm sorry. Start there. It's not complicated. Then you say what you're sorry for. Okay? It just is so much harder to actually articulate it. If you just say, I'm sorry. And then that's when you catch yourself saying really goofy things like, I'm sorry you're so easily offended. But if you don't articulate it, you might be thinking it. So you got to articulate it, and then if you find yourself saying that, you say, wait, let me try again. That was bad. I know. I'm sorry, I can't apologize well. So you say, I'm sorry for this. The other thing it just puts it out there. Maybe what you're apologizing for isn't even what the wound was about. Gives your spouse a chance to say, that is what you think is bugging me? That isn't even it. Oh, great, now we're talking. So you say, I'm sorry for this, but you can't leave it there. It's like ping pong or tennis. When you just say, I'm sorry for this, you have just hit the ball into the net. And there's no room for the other person to hit the ball back. What you're trying to do is reestablish communication and intimacy. So you got to ask them a question. What question do you think you should ask them? Will you forgive me? Will you forgive me are the 4 hardest words in the English language. It's really putting yourself out there, isn't it? It's being humble and it's saying, will you forgive me? I'm sorry for this. Will you forgive me? Do it. And then you got to wait. See, I have one of my kids who likes to say, nobody in the room, but I have one of my kids who will say, I'm sorry for such and such. Will you forgive me? It's like they don't want to wait and find out if you did. They're like running out of the room in terror that you didn't, I guess. I'm like, wait, come back. You have to wait for the answer. I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And then wait for the answer. The beauty of this is not only does it require humility from you, but it requires humility from your spouse. It requires them to be party to the act of cleaning the slate, doesn't it? They have to agree to clean the slate. They have to say, yes, I forgive you. And you can forgive people and still have to work through stuff. You understand that, don't you? You can say, yes, I forgive you for that. Can we talk about it more? Yeah, totally. But by forgiving me, there's a clean slate. Learn to apologize. Learn to apologize. I suggest you do that all the time. It's a habit in my family. Ann and I do it all the time, and it makes a big difference. And then second is give grace. You should be legalistic about your own apologies, and you should give grace to your spouse about them. You cannot walk out of here today and say, I'm not going to forgive my spouse for this area because they did not apologize right. It doesn't work that way. It does not work that way. You take the bull by the horns. You apologize. You ask for forgiveness, and you can never expect or demand reciprocation. Do you understand that? That isn't how it works. You don't get to retract your apology because they didn't follow up with theirs. And you got to give grace. The fact is, if we apologized for everything that we did to each other in my marriage, we would have no time for anything else. You've got to give grace. The marriages that survive are the ones that let things go. Love covers over a multitude of sins. Do you believe that? There is nothing noble about catching every single thing your spouse does wrong. You got to let it go. You got to sometimes step back and say, no big deal. Don't let it go. Marriages that keep a clean slate. All the marriages that do well keep a clean slate. Put it that way. Right, we got to wrap this up. And finally, a web of relationships. Have couples friends. Try to have friends that are couples that you guys can be with together. And I will tell you this very simply and briefly. Couples are all busy. Every single one of them. They've got kids or they don't have kids, but they're all busy. It is hard to make couples friends. It's not like the Dick Van Dyke Show where Jerry and his wife live next door and they drop in all the time. It doesn't happen that way anymore.